Hi, I'm Scott, and I'd like to welcome you to the 2023 September-October LD topic lecture over the right to housing resolution that's going to be delivered by both myself and by Travis Cochran. This video is meant as both a topic lecture for traditional and progressive Lincoln Douglas debate, so there are going to be parts of this video that apply to both or one or the other. But if you're doing traditional debate and Travis or I start to talk about critiques or counterplans, you can probably just use the timestamps in the description below to navigate to the next section, because it's probably not something that applies to how your circuit does debate. The final thing that I'd like to say is that this video is meant as kind of a starter set that gives you the general background on the topic and is by no means comprehensive, because it's way too early in the topic for it to be comprehensive. So if you would like to see more comprehensive content over specific components of this video, I highly encourage you to stay tuned to other videos that are going to be coming out on this channel over those different components. So welcome and hope you enjoy. So the exact wording for the September-October topic is resolved: the United States ought to guarantee the right to housing. Before I get into talking about this topic a little bit more, I would like to give everybody just a brief summary, a table of contents, if you will, of all of the different components of this topic lecture. So if you would like to just skip ahead, or you're really interested in one component, all of these different subcategories will also be listed in the timestamps below. So if you just wanted to go to Topicality, you could click that and go to that right now. But I want to start by talking about the right to housing topic in terms of the definitions of the topic before I hand it off to Travis to talk more about the history and the background of the topic. So of this topic, the keywords, I know it kind of looks like it's the whole topic, but I thought the keywords were United States, ought, guarantee, and the right to housing. So let's jump right into this. So the United States, I think that this topic is really interesting because much like the September-October 22 resolution, it does not specify that the federal government is the guarantor of the right to housing. So I think that definitions of the United States are going to be very important, because I think that some teams will try to argue that the United States is more or less than the federal government. I think some teams will try to define the United States as the states and not the actual federal government, like California or Florida, or just like a local municipality. So I think definitions of the United States and what that entails is going to be incredibly important. I also feel that ought is going to be important because it's going to imply moral obligation for the affirmative to uphold the topic. Also on that end, I think that guarantee is maybe the most important word in this resolution besides the right to health, because it makes it so that the affirmative has to fulfill the right to health and cannot sort of create conditions upon that. So it is a pledge that you will do something and fulfill certain conditions. So if you promise that you will give me $1, you have to give me $1. So I think that this will be incredibly important for maybe not only like what the topic is, but also for how a lot of arguments for the negative are going to operate in the debate, because I assume that a lot of people will argue that less than a guarantee is better than a guarantee. The final word besides right to housing that I think is important is the word the, and I think that it's important because it's not the word a, and I think that this might be more important for topicality discussions later, but I think that this might be a better argument for people, or a better wording of the resolution for people who enjoy the sort of like no subsets, bare plurals argument, because I think the might make that argument more convincing. The last thing that I want to say before I go into the actual right to housing is that note the topic says right to housing and not guaranteed housing. I think that this is one of the most important aspects of this topic, in that the resolution does not make the government guarantee housing, but rather the right to that housing. I think a good example of this is the Second Amendment, where the Second Amendment guarantees the right to bear arms or the right to own a firearm, but it does not give everybody a firearm. And I think that that is one of the core distinctions that's going to be problematic for how a lot of people approach and view this topic. So let's get more into the right to housing. So the right to housing, as defined by the United Nations, is the right to live somewhere with security, peace, and dignity. And then they give some conditions for what that looks like. Again, remember that this is very distinct from guaranteed housing. Right to housing and guaranteed housing, different things. And I think that a lot of affirmatives are going to have to think strategically about the topic in this way, because a lot of what I would consider easy arguments for the affirmative to make are going to be complicated by this fact, because doing the resolution by the text of the resolution does not mean that the government would like build people homes and give it to them. The last thing for this part of the right to housing that I would like to say is that one of the core search terms or differentiating features of this topic is how housing is treated, whether housing is treated as a commodity or whether it is treated as a right. When it's treated as a commodity, the housing is financialized, meaning it is a vehicle to generate wealth that is distinct from a social good, which would be a right. And I think that this is one of the core, or this is the core discussion of how housing on the topic will work in questioning the different modes of financialization of housing rather than guaranteed housing. So what exactly does this look like? I'm not going to read this to y'all, but I will get rid of my camera for a second. So if you want to pause the video, you can. I thought that this was a really good video, or not video, a quote that defined what the right to housing was. And I thought that, you know, all of these different components could be different things that the affirmative or negative could defend in the debate. So, you know, whether that's zoning or tax credits or right to counsel or rent control, I think all of these parts of right to housing are very interesting and are obviously beyond the scope of this video, but I think somebody will take this and utilize it to win a bunch of debates. The last part of right to housing that I want to talk about before I hand it off to Travis is, in a lot of the literature, I have seen 7 different tenets or elements or components or entitlements to right to housing. And I think that smart affirmatives and smart negatives are going to use these in different ways. So the right to housing would ensure the right to tenure. The right to tenure basically means you cannot be forcibly evicted. You cannot have threats levied against you by a landlord. You cannot be harassed by a landlord. Things like that. Another huge component of security of tenure is that in public housing, there is something known as a one-strike rule, which means for drugs or I believe the police as well, that you are kicked out of public housing. And I think affirmatives will make arguments about that for the security of tenure. The second component is the availability of services, materials, facilities, and infrastructure. I think this part is really interesting because it's going to argue that the right to housing is going to go along with giving people access to like energy, water, food, transportation, all sorts of things like that, that the negative, which I'll talk about later, is probably going to argue the AF doesn't provide, and thus is providing insufficient housing. The third component is affordability. Obviously, the housing has to be cheap. I read a stat that says that if you make minimum wage, you cannot afford a 2-bedroom apartment in anywhere in the United States. So affordability is a component to the right to housing. The fourth tenet is habitability. The house has to be adequate. It cannot be a poor house. It can't be cold. It can't be damp. It can't be too hot. It can't be accessible to the elements or have different health or structural hazards like asbestos or different aspects like that. The fifth tenet is accessibility. This is mainly for disabled people, marginalized groups that are normally not taken into account in housing. And I think people who use this tenet will look a lot at accessibility of the housing. The sixth component is the location. So this is going to go along with what I said on the second element in terms of the location of the housing. So it's going to argue that your housing must be near opportunities for employment, near healthcare, near good schools, near childcare, all sorts of different social services and facilities like that. And even might argue that, like, you know, it can't have environmental hazards, it can't be polluted, it can't be dangerous, different aspects like that will uphold the right to housing. The last aspect is that the right to housing must include housing that has cultural adequacy. I have seen a lot in the literature this talking about indigenous peoples and how they have been unfairly treated, and how the right to housing in the past has been culturally inappropriate for them. So I think that would be an interesting element of the topic to approach, to say that, you know, housing is inadequate because it doesn't take into account sort of expressions of cultural identity, and that housing must instead be able to allow for those types of expressions. So I think that different affirmative teams will use these different components to different lengths, but this is what the right to housing entails. So this is kind of a breakdown initially of what the topic is, the wording of the topic, and now I'd like to hand it over to Travis, who's going to talk about the background and the history of the right to housing.
Hi, I'm Travis Cochran, and in this part of the topic lecture, I'm going to cover an abbreviated history of a right to housing, both in the United States as well as the international arena. Then we're going to talk a little bit about who is actually responsible for implementing a right to housing, as well as how that gets done in the political process. Then we're going to talk a little bit about some of the value criteria case structures that you can use on this resolution, and some of the more popular ones that you'll see. And then finally, we'll talk about some of the major philosophical arguments that you can use for your cases for the right to housing resolution. So let's go ahead and get started with an abbreviated history of a right to housing in the United States. Now, before we begin, this is not going to cover every single policy that has ever happened on the international level or on the domestic level. This is much more of a discussion of the greater trends of a right to housing in the United States. If you want a more in-depth discussion of the history, including an emphasis on some of these policies, there's going to be some more videos coming out over the next weeks that will give you some of that historical background. You know, right now, we just want you to sort of understand the big pushes and pulls that are contributing to the forces that want a right to housing in our nation. And there's a few eras where we start to see a right to housing really being advocated for by the people and discussed amongst the legislature and the courts. And all of these different eras in United States history are all in responses to major disruptions in housing security. So, anytime there's economic events or social events or geopolitical events that causes a lot of people to suddenly be insecure in their housing situation, well, that causes the concept of a right to housing to suddenly be on the top of mind of everybody. And so the first big event that caused a right to housing to really be discussed in our nation is the Great Depression. The stock market collapse of 1929 then caused ripple effects throughout all aspects of our economy. People who were investing in the stock market, well, they lost all dollars that were invested in the stock market, but banks and institutions and businesses that were also investing in these types of vehicles, well, they lost all their money too. And so now banks were going out of business. People were losing their savings because if they had their money in their banks, then these things just went away. And now people lost their savings. Businesses are going under, so they're losing their employment, and people can no longer afford their mortgages or even basic rent. So there's a major upheaval in the ability for individuals to afford housing. And that really started the conversation going with a right to housing. And it's in response to the Great Depression with President Hoover and then followed through by President Roosevelt, where we start to see the rise of the social welfare system in the United States and the rise of social safety nets. And this is going to continue over the next few decades, but this is where we start to see, the developments of lots of different social programs, everything from Social Security to Medicare, Medicaid eventually, down the road. But it's now where we start to get the impetus for this right to housing. Now, it really gained steam in 1944 when Roosevelt, as a part of his State of the Union address, explicitly called for a right to housing and started advocating for what he deemed was necessary, which was a second Bill of Rights for the United States. Now, if you think back to when the Bill of Rights was officially, made, it was in response to what the founders of our nation saw as a great oversight in the original construction of the Constitution. In spite of all of the different things that the Constitution laid out, it never explicitly said what rights do we have, which right do the state have, and a Bill of Rights was then necessary in order to lay those out. Well, FDR believed that, we needed a second one. And in the second Bill of Rights, a right to housing should be included. So several policies, lots of policies, lots of talk, all in response to the Great Depression. Well, the next major upheaval that we had at this time was World War II. Lots and lots of Americans were forced to leave their homes. They're drafted, or they're, voluntarily chose to fight in this war, whether in the Pacific Theater or the European theater. They then all come back home. And what happens after World War II is we then immediately transition into the baby boom era, where Americans come back from World War II. We now have peace. We've invested so much of our resources into manufacturing and industrialization because they're needed for the war effort, that we now have this thriving economy. People are coming back. But now all these soldiers coming back who want to start families of their own, who are out, trying to have their own lives, they need houses. And this is where we get the second big push. And this is sort of a continuation from a lot of the policies that we see in response to the Great Depression. And again, we see sort of the second big wave and the second big push for the next few decades of the building and the strengthening and the revitalization of that social welfare system, the social safety nets that we have in the United States. And one of the big major pieces of legislation that come about during this time is the GI Bill, where in order to incentivize individuals to join the military, they would offer housing. And so again, right to housing becomes necessary. And so up through 1966, about, this time, we start to really see some more developments, or all the way up through the end of the 70s. But in 1980, we have a new presidential administration come in. We shift from an era of Democrat control to Ronald Reagan and Republicans. And Ronald Reagan, and a big part of his administration, as well as the Republican legislature of the time, followed closely by Bush and even a little bit by Clinton, started to push a lot of policies of austerity and started to push back on this idea that the social safety net and the welfare net are good. A big part of Ronald Reagan's campaign strategy was the creation of this concept of the welfare queen, which is a very racialized concept of, poor black women who are intentionally taking advantage of social services like welfare and cheating the hardworking taxpayers of the nation. Now, there isn't truth in this stereotype, but this campaign approach really did a lot to sort of foment hatred of social services. So for decades, whereas we've been gaining momentum toward a right to housing and finding, these government policies that both contributed to an adequate supply of housing as well as resources in order to get housing for individuals, whether they be FHA loans or anything along those lines, whatever it may be, we now see during the Reagan years a pushback on all of those policies, and we start to see cuts to all of the housing policies. And so, but in addition to that, we start to see cuts to social services across the board. So we're starting to see cuts to mental health services. We're starting to see cuts to healthcare. Starting to see cuts to Medicare, Medicaid, whatever kind of jobs programs. And all of these things are compounding into a situation where individuals are starting to get less of the resources they need from the government, which is making it more difficult for them in order to secure housing, which in turn leads to a housing crisis. Now, the housing crisis continued to get worse and worse and worse and worse, even though the housing market at different points thrived and thrived and thrived and thrived. So the next big pressure that led to a push for a right to housing in the United States is the response to the Great Recession of 2007, 2008. So in 2007, the housing market collapsed in the United States due to a number of different factors, but basically it's about investment vehicles that overvalued the safety of the housing markets and were too confident in Americans' abilities to afford their mortgages. And when it turned out that more and more Americans were unable to afford their mortgages, then a lot of individuals started to give up their homes. Their homes were foreclosed upon, which in turn caused a lot more homes to be on the market. And, basic laws of supply and demand, if the supply of homes increases, if all of a sudden there were a lot of homes, then the price of homes drops, which means that the home values for everybody else started to decline as well. And then some more people then owed more on their mortgages than their homes were worth, which then compounded the problem. Some people were forced to sell their home at a loss. And it led to the situation where millions upon millions upon millions of homeowners were losing their homes due to financial instability in these markets. And so in the Obama administration, it became a renewed push for securing housing, for making sure that people got access to loans, for making sure that people got protections and forgiveness. And again, all of these things, access to housing, affordability of housing, these are central components of a right to housing. So even if a right to housing wasn't outright discussed, all of the sort of, parts and pieces that are necessary in order to really have a true discussion of one are still there. Now, theoretically, we've done a lot of things to fix the 2008 crisis, arguably, and there's a good argument that maybe we haven't fixed anything from the Great Recession. And now we're starting to see another problem with housing right now. A little bit different from a few eras. First of all, a few years ago, you might not remember, but there was this giant pandemic that's still around. COVID happened, and that caused a number of different sectors of the economy to be forced to shut down in order to control the spread of the virus. But even those that weren't forced to shut down had a huge slowdown. So you had individuals that were really reliant upon their income, whether it's in the service industry or whether it's in the entertainment industry, the tourist industry, depending on where you were in the part of the world, you might have lost your job. And which again, in turn, makes it much more difficult to afford a home. Now, in order to jumpstart the economy, the Federal Reserve just slashed interest rates. And when the Federal Reserve slashes interest rates, this makes it easier for people to borrow money. It makes people to get loans from banks, and they don't have to pay as much interest. And that's true of a lot of different types of loans, but especially true of home loans. And so during the pandemic, after the Federal Reserve slashed interest rates down to nothing, practically, people were able to get home loans, especially if they had good credit, at 2 or 3%, which is just dirt cheap. We're talking about all-time historical lows that people could afford to buy homes. So anybody, while a lot of people in the world were absolutely hurt by the pandemic, not everybody was. There's a lot of people who were still able to work. There's a lot of people who were able to, not skip a beat. If you're an office manager whose office goes remote, well, all of a sudden, you're now saving money. You're not spending money on commute, but your job is not under a threat. You're just now doing it from home through Zoom, which means that you had no disruption to your income, and at the same time, you now have access to dirt cheap home loans. So what happened? Well, people started buying homes left and right for those that could. And that meant that all of the homes started to increase in value. Why? Because again, supply and demand. People are buying the homes, which means there's no longer any homes on the market. So what happens to the price of all homes? Well, everybody wants to buy a house and there's no homes to buy. The prices of those homes skyrocket. And so now, if you weren't fortunate enough to buy a home, because maybe your credit score wasn't that good, or maybe you didn't have the down payment, or maybe you were part of the millions upon millions upon millions who were actually impacted by COVID, you missed out on this great opportunity to buy a home with these wonderful interest rates. And now the price of homes has just shot up so much that you might have missed out on your chance to buy a home forever. And so now housing is less affordable than ever before. The supply of homes is at an all-time low because COVID also disrupted the supply chains for everything. Because whole sectors, we couldn't work, we couldn't go anywhere, which means people couldn't build things, which means manufacturers couldn't manufacture things, which means all the things that we needed to build houses weren't being built. And so now, there's not enough houses. The houses that are there aren't affordable. So we're having a renewed push for discussions for a right to housing. And that's why we have the resolution today. So when we're talking about a right to housing, it's not only a discussion that's happening in the United States, it's also happening abroad. So in international law, a right to housing has been discussed in two different ways, through binding agreements and non-binding agreements. Now, non-binding agreements, you don't have to follow them. Now, you pledge to follow them, but you don't have to. There's no punishment if you don't. Now, when we're talking about non-binding agreements, these usually come in the forms of either declarations, agendas, or recommendations. The most popular non-binding agreement, or not most popular, but the one that we're all going to talk about, the one that we've all heard of, is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This was established in 1948 when the United Nations got together, codified human rights, and said that these are the basic human rights that we should all have. In it, that also laid the foundation for a right to housing. And even though the United States is a signatory to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which forms the basis of a right to housing, it's a non-binding agreement. So we're not necessarily forced to comply to it in order to be in line with international law. Now, the next big wave of non-binding agreements came in the 2010s. And there's a number of different agreements. A lot of these impact different vulnerable populations, whether they be migrants, whether they be prisoners, whether they be the unhoused. And these are a lot of recommendations and agendas that come from two groups, the Human Rights Council and a specific program as part of the United Nations known as the New Urban Agenda. And again, these are recommendations. These are things that we should do to adopt a right to housing, but there's nothing forcing people to do that. Now, on the flip side, there are binding agreements. And when we're talking about binding agreements in international law, we're talking about treaties. And the three big dates to understand in terms of treaties is the first one is in 1966, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. The second one, 1992, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And then in 1994, we got two treaties. We got the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination and the Convention Against Torture. Now, none of these treaties explicitly said that people have a right to housing. However, they either ban discrimination based on the fact that someone might be unhoused, or they might say that having resources such as housing is a precondition to securing other rights. Now, again, they don't explicitly say that there is a right to housing, but they form the international legal basis that there should be. So, if we agree that there should be a right to housing, the big question is going to be, how do we guarantee it? So, we're going to be talking about the who and the how of a right to housing. Who is going to guarantee a right to housing? How are they going to do it? Now, unfortunately, that's not really a simple conversation. Housing policy in the United States is very, very, very complicated. There are a lot of ways that housing policy is shaped. It happens at the local level. It happens at the state level. It happens at the federal level. It happens in the international level. So if you're expecting this part of the topic lecture to be super detailed as to the minutia of how a right to housing is guaranteed, I can't do that. There's just not enough time, because there's a lot of different combinations of ways in which a right can be established, then it can be implemented, and then it can be enforced. So let's focus just on a general of the who and a general of the how for now. And in future videos, we'll get into much more of the specifics as we discuss things like affirmatives, plan mechanisms, as well as counterplans. So first, the who. Well, courts can do this, okay? Courts can establish a right to housing. Or they can say that there is a right to housing that already exists based on state constitutions or the federal constitution. So municipal courts, state courts, federal courts, depending on different things, can argue or make case law that would set the legal basis for a right to housing. Now, Congress, of course, can do this themselves. So whether you have legislation from the Senate or legislation from the House, Congress has that capability. Now, the president can also do that. So the president can do that themselves, or the executive branch and all of the various agencies that are part of the executive branch. So whether we're talking about housing and urban development, whether we're talking about trade or anything else, all of these things are possible different agencies that are able to make rulings or make decisions, are able to enforce different aspects of a right to housing. Now, the UN and various international courts, they can also help shape a right to housing, but so can non-governmental organizations and grassroots organizations. This resolution says that the United States ought to guarantee a right to housing. It doesn't specify United States federal government. So there is an argument that to guaranteeing a right to housing could utilize some of these, all of these, one of these. So who is guaranteeing a right to housing in any affirmative you see? That's a great question, and I think that should be one of the first questions in cross-ex. So then, if there's a lot of people who can do a right to housing, how does it happen? Unfortunately, it's very similar answer. There's a lot of different ways. I mean, local, state, federal legislation can all make different recommendations, actions. You can do funding. You can do different zoning codes. All different things, whether you're talking funding, enforcement, or reform. All of these things can be done at the local, state, and federal levels. Now, you can also have direct ballot initiatives. In places like where I live in California, every single election we have all of these direct ballot initiatives which have the ability to actually shape the law in the books that we get to vote for. Now, that's important because that allows you to even skip the legislative process. We say it happens, it goes right to the governor's desk, sign it, and it happens. So the people can get involved in these types of things. So referenda are possible ways of how a right to housing can happen. Now the courts can happen. So whether you're talking municipal, state, federal court rulings, different levels, whether you're talking about criminal conduct, in terms of how many homes people can own. For instance, there's a lot of policies now that are talking about rental housing and Airbnb owners that are trying to limit how many homes that people can own in order to use as rental properties so that more homes are available on the market for people who want to live in them to buy. But again, the courts make rulings based on laws and constitutions. So you can change state and federal constitutions in order to guarantee a right to housing. But the president can do it themselves. We already talked about that. So through executive orders or through the various agencies that make up the executive branch, through agency rulings or enforcement or reform or funding, all of these are different ways of how a right to housing can be guaranteed. It can also happen in the international level. We talked about the UN can do it. And the international courts can make rulings and enforce those types of things. Now, when we're talking about a right to housing and actually guaranteeing it, non-binding agreements ain't going to get it done. It has to be a binding agreement. So if we're talking about how it's going to happen on the international level, we're going to be talking about treaties, which means that we're talking about new treaties. We're talking about signing or ratifying existing treaties. But it also means implementing treaties, because just because you've signed a treaty, you've ratified a treaty, you've pledged to follow that treaty, doesn't mean you're following through. So you might need additional things in order to follow through on that. And what do those additional things look like? Literally anything that's on this list. Legislation, funding, reform, enforcement. All of these things could be necessary to fulfill the obligations of a treaty. And then finally, again, it says the United States. Maybe the United States doesn't mean the government itself. Maybe it's the people. Why can't grassroots organizations or non-governmental organizations take steps to provide housing for people? Maybe it's topical, maybe it's not. Interesting question, though. So there's a lot of different case structures that you can have. So for those of you that are thinking about writing a traditional value criteria case, the good news is that a lot of the old reliable values and criteria that you're used to can be used on both the aff and the neg for this resolution. So whether you're a utilitarianism debater and you really just want to talk about universal morality, you want to talk about the consequences of plan, you want to talk about those contentions, you can do that. You can do that on the aff and the neg. And if you want some discussion of some specific contentions that are going to go great with utilitarianism and consequentialism, you can look to Scott's next section where he's going to be talking about all of those different things. So I'm not going to go into detail because Scott's going to do that for you. Now, of course, there's also morality. There's Kant, deontology, and talking about the universal sorts of rights that a right to housing may or may not be representative of. And there's a discussion as to whether a right to housing can be universal. Can positive rights be universal? Can negative rights be universal? Those are conversations that we're going to have in just a few minutes for the philosophical Affs and negs, but I'm just kind of hinting here because these can absolutely be part of your traditional value criteria cases. You can also talk about structural violence. When we're talking about housing, we're talking about something that is necessary to feed people, to protect people, and when you don't have housing, you're exposed to violences and indignities on a daily level that are just almost unimaginable. And being unhoused and feeling housing insecurity, that's a form of structural violence. And so Affs would like to talk about how we should prioritize structural violence are always going to be able to be ran on this Aff. On this resolution. Now also, you can talk about justice. Lots of different conceptions. So whether you're talking about social justice, talking about civil conceptions of justice, you can do that. If you want to have a value that's predicated on agency and the ability for us to have the independent actions, which a lot of people argue is a prerequisite to all moral decision making, you can do that. If you say that recognition of personhood is the most formal, primal value that there is, or, sort of the ultimate value, you can do that. There's a lot of people that talk about how personhood, if we are not individual people, then we don't have access to things like morality. Therefore, we can't make claims like ought. Same thing with autonomy. If we can't make our decisions, well, we can't be moral agents. Also, a right to life. Housing is necessary for us to live. It gives us shelter. But also value to life. Not, you can live without housing, but what kind of a life is that? It's really hard. It's a struggle. And so you have to have a quality of life, not just actual life. So all of these things can be talked about as value criterion sort of cases. Those are your all reliable values. Now, your all reliable criterion, they're all right there too. So if you want to talk about human rights, that's fine. You can do that. Human rights is necessary to secure personhood, necessary to secure agency, necessary to secure justice. Human rights are good because they are universal, and thus examples of deontological goods. Human rights are good because they are the best way to secure peace, prosperity, love, democracy, whatever. Utilitarianism. Now, if you want to say that justice is the best value, how do you do that? Well, you can talk about Rawls and the veil of ignorance, or the original position, and that we should be assuming the position of the most vulnerable in the world. And whenever we're deciding whether we ought to do something, we say, would it be good for the people who are most vulnerable? We can look at this through the lens of harms reduction and harms mitigation. And the best way to choose whether or not we do something as the government is, does it reduce harm to the people? We can talk about positive rights. Are positive rights good? Negative rights, those good. Are those key to morality? Are they universal? So all of these different values get access to there. International law can be a criterion in and of itself, because that can be something that is good to achieve consequentialist sort of ethical considerations, like, ILAW could be good for international peace, which could stop war, could be good for free trade. But international law could also be good for other sorts of values that we talked about, such as justice. Or because international law codifies a single universal law, whether it's objective or not, there's an argument that it is a type of universal morality. Autonomy, social contract, rule of law. These are all different criteria that we love, know, talk about all the time. You get to use again. Now, there's a couple other topic-specific criteria that I want to talk to you about that are specific to how we measure whether or not a right to housing is guaranteed. The first one is what's called progressive realization. And this is a standard that was developed in South African courts in order to measure whether or not a right to housing is actually being implemented. The South African Constitution now calls for a right to housing. And the way the courts decided whether or not they know if that right is actually being upheld is whether or not there's a progressive realization. What does that mean? Well, it's a standard of measurement that determines what does the state have to do in order to guarantee this right? And is it reasonable? So you have to see, is it reasonable for the state to do what's necessary? So all things that are reasonable and aren't particularly burdensome, the state is required to do. Now, if there's an unreasonable burden on government expenditures, like the government only takes in so much money, so they can only have so much to spend. So there's a limit to how much you have to contribute as the government to implementing, enforcing, guaranteeing a right to housing that balances the needs of the most vulnerable with what is reasonable for you to actually do. And this works great with the value of human rights. This works great with the value of justice. This works great with the value of quality. And this is a criteria that you can use that is specific to the topic and grounded in the literature and the case law of a right to housing. The other little one that I want to talk to is about a maximum of value of available resources. So how do we know if we're guaranteeing a right to housing? Well, if we're contributing a maximum of available resources, then we do. What does that look like? Well, a maximum available resource is an obligation that's based on a sliding scale between the available resources we have to spend for the government and the institutional development. So basically, what resources do we have to spend, and how well established are our institutions, our economy, our structures, our social safety? Because we have to balance. Sure, yeah, we have to prioritize spending money on housing, but we have all of these other things to develop institutionally for our nation that could contribute long-term to a right to housing. So we have to do both. We can't completely abandon housing, but we can't focus entirely on it at the expense of all the other social safety net things that we need in order to eventually make sure that people have the money, healthcare, freedom, in order to get housing. Now, the other aspect of a criterion of maximum of available resources is that all policies that are deliberately retrogressive measures, which means that all policies that intentionally try to hurt housing, are not going to be justified ever, unless the reason for that is it's the only thing to do based on that sliding scale of available resources and institutional development. So maybe there is a world where we should not provide housing because there's a possible world where we should have other forms of institutional development that might be better. Now, this is a particularly useful criterion for neg cases where if you're in a traditional district and you have to have a value criteria case, but you want to discuss counterplans, this is a great way because you can talk about other institutional development goals or policies that should be preferred in order to balance available resources. So this might mean that you can say, no, we shouldn't do a right to housing through this. We should have this other specific social policy, education, something, healthcare, which we think is a better use of the available resources that we have. So functionally, it gives you a trade-off disadvantage as a contention, as well as the ability to offer a counter plan that solves for the things a right to housing would solve for, all within the traditional structure of a value criterion case. So it's a way to be sneaky progressive while still being traditional. Okay. Final thing that we're going to talk about is the different philosophical options that you have on the aff and the neg. Now, we already talked about justice. I think that justice is going to be one of the more strategic options, specifically the use of John Rawls. John Rawls says that social justice is the ultimate value that we can achieve in our society and government, and that the best way to ensure as to whether or not a policy will uphold justice is to place ourselves into what he says is the original position. So we should pretend that we have a veil over our face and that we're ignorant of where we are and what's happening in the world. And so we don't know whether or not a policy is going to be good or bad for us as an individual. So instead of choosing a policy or choosing some sort of recommendation, instead of choosing whether or not it's good or bad just in the abstract, in the particular for us, we should imagine if we were the most vulnerable person possible and see if it's good for us in that position of the most vulnerable person. And if and only if it is good for us then it would be a policy that would uphold the position of social justice. Now, another potential approach is a couple different concepts from the philosophy of Jacques Derrida. Pros the idea of cosmopolitanism, hospitality. Basically, one of the most ethical things that we can do is provide hospitality toward the other. Housing is a great form of hospitality. Emmanuel Levinas is another philosopher that you can use for your cases that talks about how we should derive ethics from the encounter with the stranger. And so basically when we see a stranger and when we see their face and we realize, oh my gosh, you're different from me. But at the same time, you're also a person. And that means that there's people who are different from me. Wow! What happens if someone sees someone who's different from them? Well, I hope they treat them like they would me. And so it kind of creates this relationship where it's through this encounter with the stranger when we see another's face, where it's through that uncertainty that we should sort of create all of our ethics. And we should create it based on this hospitality. Again, Derrida derives things from Levinas, where we should provide hospitality to the stranger as the most ethical thing to do, which would mean giving them housing. And again, you can talk about utilitarianism and all the different types, whether it's act utilitarianism, rule utilitarianism, global utilitarianism, go to town. And of course, Kant. A lot of y'all are going to, philosophical debater types are going to go to Kant because you always go to Kant. And there's a robust discussion in the topic literature as to whether or not a right to housing can be considered a deontological moral imperative. Okay, there's a lot of discussion as to whether or not negative rights are the only rights that can be a deontological imperative, or if positive rights can also be a deontological imperative. So let's break down the difference real quick. A negative right is freedom from some type of oppression. These are rights that guarantee liberty. They prevent someone from impacting you negatively. Now, a positive right is the opposite. It's an affirmative obligation for the state to do something to benefit you. So it's not stopping the state from doing something bad against you. It's forcing the state to do something good for you. There are a lot of philosophers that say that only negative rights can be universal because positive rights might actually end up hurting someone else. Because if the state is obligated to give you something, where do they get that thing? They might have to take it from somewhere, and maybe the person that they take it from or the thing they take it from then has their rights violated in that process. Now, there's also some discussion in the literature as to whether or not a right to housing is a positive right or a negative right. Now, a lot of people discuss it as a positive right because it's the government being obligated to give something good. However, there are some philosophers that discuss a right to housing as grounded in a right to shelter, which means a freedom from having someone move you out of shelter, which would reframe a positive right into a negative right, and thus making it a deontological moral imperative. So whether you're on the aff or the neg, you can talk Kant if you really want. And that is it for what I'm talking to you about now. Scott's going to give you a whole lot more about some of the contentions, as well as disadvantages, counterplans, and I'll talk to you at the end of this topic lecture about some of the more critical arguments that you're going to hear.
Thanks, Travis. I want to start by talking about different advantage areas or contentions that I think affirmative teams can utilize on the right to housing topic. The first one, I know it seems like, the most generic one out there that everybody always reads, but I think it's particularly good on this topic, and that is the economy contention. I think teams will say that the right to housing allows people to have jobs, allows people to have some type of financial benefit that boosts the economy. I also think that this will be related to different industries or different markets, particularly the housing market, and how boosting the housing market will also in turn boost the economy. So I think the economy contention will be really good on this topic. I think for contentions that aren't up the utilitarian calculus alley, I think that homelessness or houselessness is going to be a really good advantage topic area because it's just really core to the literature that a lot of the authors on this topic are referencing. The third advantage area, I think, is human rights. A lot of the literature, when it talks about the right to housing, talks about the human right to housing, and I think that a lot of teams are going to claim that the action of the affirmative boosts U.S. human rights credibility or just human rights overall, and that is going to have some benefit to the affirmative team in the debate. I think that the next advantage area that people will read is like structural violence or racism, poverty, this group of contentions. And I think that this is one of the best contention areas on this topic because it's just kind of truthful in the sense that there's a lot of racial justice issues around housing, how different zoning laws in the past have led to segregated housing, how housing has a direct correlation to inequality and poverty, and how, in a certain sense, the root of housing for a lot of Black people in America comes from sort of like the promise of the United States federal government to give reparations for slavery. And I think that there will be teams that argue that the right to housing is a way to access that. I also think that people will argue that kind of like the way current housing is, it kind of like works as a gated community where there's no access, sort of like, historically zoning has been a reaction to people of color trying to live in white neighborhoods and that housing is really segregated. So I think that all of those lead me to believe that this will be one of the best advantage areas on the topic. I also think that disease or health will be just as good because I think that people will argue that having housing is key to sort of prevent pandemics. It allows people to be clean. It allows people to quarantine. It allows people to sort of get off the streets. It allows people to focus on mental health. And traditionally on topics where a team argues for the right to something, they will argue that other rights will come with that. So the right to health and the right to health care are really tied together with the right to housing a lot. And I think that you will have teams argue about the right to education, the right to water, sanitation, all sorts of different arguments like that. They're going to be based around the right to housings being correlated to the disease or health advantage area. I also think that international law or hegemony arguments are going to be really good on this topic. And the reason for that is that on domestic topics, teams normally have to defend their actor more. And traditionally, teams have done this by like using the courts or using Congress to uphold international agreements and then claim benefits off of that as a defense to the affirmative. And I think that that will be particularly popular, especially with what Travis had to talk about in terms of different international agreements that the sort of the U.S. doesn't really uphold. The second to last area that I want to talk about is climate. I think that this is going to be really, really popular. There's a lot of literature here. There's a lot of literature specifically talking about how there are people who are impacted by climate change and that we need to have the right to housing in order to be able to be resilient in the face of climate change and build new housing that will be resilient to climate change as it worsens. Another affirmative that I think will be really good, or a different way to access the climate contention, will say green housing for everybody, and will claim some type of climate-based impact off of that. I think the final thing is that teams are going to say capitalism is bad on the affirmative on this topic. I think it's just very intuitive for how the topic works in criticizing the financialization of housing. And I think because of this, sort of affirmatives that choose to decommodify the topic will argue capitalism as a topic area. Now, let's go into different plans that I think, or different affirmatives, cases that could be read on kind of like a circuit or progressive level. First, I want to say that this topic was debated before. It was debated in 2017, word for word, verbatim. So this has been debated before. The thing that's different is that that topic was a March-April topic. So there's not as many sort of like progressive arguments that were available to get some ideas from. What I will say is immigration affirmatives were incredibly popular. People gave the right to housing for Syrian immigrants. I assume people will sort of specify all sorts of different immigrant categories that can migrate to the United States and then claim a right to housing based off of that. And I think that this will kind of lead to a ton of different affirmatives on the topic, because the affirmative will just specify a specific group of immigrants and will have advantages based off that. I also think that military affirmatives will be popular. Just like I said, how the affirmative will read courts affs because they have to defend the agent. I think that military affs function the same way. I wouldn't be surprised if somebody reads like a right to housing on military bases affirmative. I think what would be more popular would be an affirmative that gives the right to housing to immigrants who agree to serve a certain term in the military. I think one of the presidential candidates actually has that on their agenda. So I think that these are also like real world things. I think another thing to think about is sort of the military allies of the United States in Afghanistan that were left behind after we pulled out. I think that there's an affirmative there where people will argue that we need to specifically give those people the right to housing inside the United States because we kind of like left them there. I think that the next group of affirmative plans will be probably the most popular on the topic and were some of the most popular affirmatives on the last topic. I also think that if you're not a progressive debater, that all of these can just be read as different contentions on the topic and will be really good, especially if you're reading a non-util aff. I think that these contentions will talk about domestic violence. I think they'll talk about sexual violence. They'll give women the right to housing, kids, orphans, teachers. There's a lot of really good arguments that say teachers can't live in the counties that they work in, so they need the right to housing in those areas. Disability will be huge. Trans youth, I saw a bunch of articles on different LGBTQ plus groups, families, intimate partner violence survivors, victims of sexual trafficking. I'll put these two here because I'm pretty sure that they were read on the last topic, but also because people will criticize different wordings of how you mention or say these groups. I think immigrants is also a specific group. You notice that seems to be a theme here. I predict that there will be a lot of immigration-based affirmatives. The next group of affirmative plans is going to be specific regions. I think people will say the states can do things. I think people will even have like specific states or counties like California or different municipalities do. the affirmative. I think the problem with this is like states is plural, but I mean, that's obviously up for debate depending on you have some kind of interesting way to answer that. Maybe an interstate compact. I think the next group of affirmative plans are going to have some sort of specific part of the right to housing. Earlier on, I had that huge list of like the right to counsel, all sorts of different things like that. I think that all of that kind of stuff will be under here, sort of enacting rent control, Section 8, no evictions, getting rid of the one strike rule. All of these will be different types of affirmatives that I think will be really, really, really popular on the topic. Some other affirmatives that I think will be really popular. I think people are going to specify the type of home. I think people will say adequate in the plan text and then specify what adequate means. I also think people will say like multifamily homes or public housing, or there'll be tiny homes or 3D printed homes. I think people will try to get tricky with this. I also think that, all of these could obviously be read as picks in debates as well. I think that people will also read agent affs. Courts affs will be really popular. Congress, the states. And I think that people will read advantages that will defend their agent as well. I think the declaration aff that only declares the right but doesn't actually give it will be popular, and then kind of say that, we no link all your DAs, but we have some sort of intrinsic advantage just based off declaring it a right. I think the sort of flip to that would be an affirmative that demonstrates the right to housing in a specific region and then says that that spills up to the right to housing, but with no link out of sort of the overall right to housing because you only do it in a very specific fashion. I think that there will be a legal or human rights affirmative. I think that people will read the whole resolution affirmative. I also think that sort of also in line with how I was talking about accessibility earlier in the lecture, I think people will read different accommodation-based affirmatives, talking about electricity, showers, bathrooms. I think in the past, people have read a lot of affirmatives about broadband and internet being provided as an accommodation. Again, there's just some ideas that I have on the topic. It's not a comprehensive list. There's going to be tons of different affirmatives that are going to be read on this topic. So now that we've talked about the aff, let's flip it over to the neg for a second. So for the negative, I think that the economy DA, just like the economy contention on the aff, is going to be really good. I think people are going to argue that interest rates will go up, that rent prices will go up, that housing prices are going to go up, that the housing market and the stock market are going to be somehow adversely effective, that, obviously the government has to like pay for the enforcement or the housing or whatever you think the right to housing is versus guaranteed housing. And that obviously requires money. So there's going to be a taxes economy contention for sure, as well as just like, just normal economy arguments. I also think that tied into these economy arguments are going to be arguments about specific industries where people will say a certain business's confidence is wrecked because of the right to housing. I think the construction industry, manufacturing, lumber, like obviously if the affirmative defends constructing homes, all of the different components, the plumbing, the electrical wires, the electricians, all of those different components or aspects to the right to housing will be core negative ground to read disads against. I also think, in line with spending money, that a lot of affirmatives will link to trade-off arguments where because the affirmative gives the right to housing, they're going to have to, not give some other type of service that the government provides. And I think this provides core disad ground for like an education trade-off DA, healthcare, social security, things like that. I think that there is different location DAs that people make on the topic, right? They'll say since housing is popular in one area, if it's in an urban area, the people will flee the rural area and go to the urban area or vice versa. I think people make arguments about there just not being enough inventory or housing. People will make arguments about urbanization being popular and sort of prioritizing urbanization being good and bad. I also think that there are going to be a bunch of arguments about segregation where the negative is just going to say the affirmative gives people the right to bad homes, not the right to good homes, and that they still have to follow certain exclusionary practices that just lead to people getting bad homes, like how redlining or public housing or the projects currently work in the status quo. And there's a lot of different ways in which exclusionary zoning works in the status quo to do this. I also think that the politics dissad is going to be particularly popular. I think that people will read arguments that say that Republicans, wealthy people, the elite really dislike the right to housing. It costs them money, etc. And that will be a really good access point for negatives in the debate. The last two arguments in the debate for sort of the negative for disadvantages are, I think the negative will read the sort of like a military recruitment argument. They'll say recruitment's good now, but the military can't get enough recruits if housing is provided because, they poach people who are in insecure situations to join the military. And if the affirmative would take that away, there would not be as many people for the military to be able to fill its ranks. I think that this will be an interesting argument to see the direction of how it goes on the topic. I think another argument like this is kind of like the government coercion DA, where it's like you kind of force governmentality upon people by saying they must have this right, and that's bad because it leads to the government intervening into your personal life. The next area for the negative is counterplans. I think that there will be tons of agent counterplans, just like I said, how Affs will have to defend their agent. The negatives will test the agent. I think that the state's counterplan is going to be the biggest counterplan of the agent type that people will read, but they'll also read Congress, different courts counterplans, executive orders, different agencies like HUD or the Treasury or something like that. I'll say it again, the state's counterplan is going to be really popular. Domestic topics, the state's counterplan. I think word picks are going to be really good on this topic because in the literature, especially if you're going to talk about houselessness, that there's a really good homelessness, houselessness debate. I also think that when you're talking about urbanization, development, things like that, that those all lead to potential word pick style debates. I also think people will have counterplans where you use alternative mechanisms, sort of like, a UBI instead of housing, a jobs guarantee instead of housing, a living wage, different mechanisms that would resolve the same substance of the affirmative without doing it, and then just reading a disadd to the topic. I also think there will be sort of the regulations counterplan. I've talked a lot about different regulations. I think people will get rid of the regulation, don't make it a right, and then just read the rights DA. Which leads me to say I think people will also pick out of rights. They will guarantee housing but not do rights, and then read arguments against why rights is a good idea. I think people are also going to pick out of the word guarantee. I think that this is especially true for process counterplan type teams because I think guarantee probably means that the affirmative has to be certain. So if the affirmative with their AF is going to say guarantee, I think the negative can test that word potentially instead of testing words like ought or should or resolved, which are, in my opinion, way more shady than the word guarantee. And I think that smart counterplan teams will definitely potentially take advantage of that. The next thing that I want to talk about is circumvention. So I think that this comes at the angle, I talked about this before, but just the resolution guarantees the right. It doesn't guarantee actual housing. So I think that people are going to say the affirmative doesn't do anything, and sort of like a presumption argument because there's no law that accompanies it that actually forces these things to happen. I think another argument that will go along with this, that's, you could call me old school, but I think there's sort of like a plan doesn't meet the needs, what people would call a PMN, is that just there's other needs that people have: transportation, jobs, childcare, education, healthcare, that aren't provided in housing. Now, I know I've talked about previously that, maybe that's a component of the right to housing, but I think that, this will be a good test of where the topic ends up going and how some of these solvency arguments are treated. I think the final solvency argument that you can make is kind of just like a large category of just like a pushback against the AF of just like, there's no homes, the homes that are available have no quality, there's no workers to build the homes, there's all sorts of federal requirements, like you have to, if you build a home near the beach, you have to make sure it doesn't mess up the sea turtles. There's all sorts of government red tape that I think that the affirmative is going to have to figure out a way to answer, and the negative is really going to ask some tough questions of the affirmative in these debates. The final area that I want to talk about before I hand it back off to Travis to finish up is topicality. I think that the first part, I mentioned this in the definitions part, but I think that there might be a decent argument for a no subsets or bare plurals. I don't think this is a good argument, but I think that semantically, the word the versus the word a being in the resolution might mean that this argument is popular. I'm not saying it's good. I just think it means that teams that tend to read these arguments will definitely read them. I also think teams will make a bunch of specification arguments. I think they'll say you must do a specific type of right, obviously to try to set up a counterplan that picks out of that right or does a different type of right. I also think that the negative will read T arguments that says rights means all rights, and they'll again use that to try to pick out of different rights, but they'll also say it must be both a positive and negative right. It must be one or the other. It must be both. And that will be a T debate on the topic. I also think the word guarantee is going to be debated as a topicality argument on this topic. I think that a lot of people just might do this to set up the certainty debate for their process counterplans. But I think that the word guarantee to set up other arguments, not necessarily as a topicality argument to go for, seems strategic to me. I think people will take advantage of the word United States. So I think people will read affirmatives that have like the states do it instead of the federal government. And that will be a topicality argument that different people will debate. I also think there will be a ton of different specification arguments, whether it be how it's implemented, enforced, an agent, right? So it says US. So, that's not only a debate about is it the states, is it the federal government, but it's a debate, do you have to say Congress? Do you have to say courts? What does the affirmative actually have to defend in the text of the affirmative? I think that there will be a bunch of specification arguments about this. And I also think that both effects and extra T are going to be huge on this topic because people are going to do things in the affirmative that are beyond the scope of just the right to housing, or they are going to do certain things like get rid of rent control and then claim that doing rent control or that getting rid of rent control leads to the right to housing. So I think that both extra and effects T will be really popular on the topic as well. So that's what I have to say for this portion of the video. I'm going to hand it over to Travis, who's going to finish by talking about critical arguments.
Thank you so much, Scott, for covering all of that. Again, I'm Travis Cochran, and I'll be finishing up this topic lecture with a discussion of some of the critical arguments that you'll hear in both the AF and the neg. Again, brief disclaimer, like all parts of this topic lecture, we're not going to go too in-depth into any one of these specific arguments, and this is also not going to be comprehensive. We're not going to cover all of the critical arguments on both the AF and the neg. We're just trying to give you a brainstorming opportunity so you can get an idea of some of the things that you'll see, or maybe pique your interest in some of the research areas that you might want to explore a little bit further. So are we covering everything? Not at all. But I promise there's going to be some more videos here in the next few weeks that is going to give you a lot more information that you'll need if you're a critical debater on the right to housing topic. So let's start with critical arguments that you're going to hear on the negative. First are the various forms of capitalisms, okay? So these are all different types of anti-capitalism criticisms, but where they put their focus on is very different. You're going to have your orthodox anti-capitalisms like your Marxism, and those are going to be on labor, okay? So all about labor and all about who's profiting from the housing market, what's being denied from laborers in order to get them to continue producing. But then there's also extractivism, which doesn't necessarily look so much at the labor of capitalism, but more about the resource extraction. And housing is resource intensive. Every time you build a house, you got to build it with materials. So if you're building it with wood frames, where are you getting this wood? Are you getting it from forests? Okay. Now, you also need land. Where are you taking this land? Are you taking up some canyon land? Are you taking up farmland? Are you taking up forests? What resources are you extracting and which land are you clearing in order to make this happen? And there's serious consequences as to the choices that you make. A right to housing, we need a lot more housing, which means a lot more extraction. Now, there's also financialization and the financial capitalism. And a right to housing in the United States cannot be discussed without also discussing debt and debt economics and mortgages and how housing often ties us into form of debts, into forms of normalization and control through things like our credit scores, which dictate what we can do. We talk about how bad the social credit scores of China are, when the truth is the credit scores here that we have dictate a lot of the same things. You're not able to get on a plane without buying a ticket without a credit card. You can't get a credit card if you don't have a credit score. Credit scores and social credit, not that much different. Then, of course, you have racial capitalism, because the system of capitalism and the system of housing in the United States cannot be discussed without also discussing the history of settler colonialism as well as the chattel slavery, and how indigenous groups had their land taken. So when we're talking about a right to housing, we're talking about right to housing for settlers, but we're also talking about individuals like where individuals who are most impacted by a lack of housing are your BIPOC folk, which is all indicative of the way that race and capital and settler colonialism and anti-blackness have merged into the structure we call racial capitalism. And then, of course, you have semiotic capital, which is the idea that that capitalism is now all about signs as signifiers and is more about data. And so this right to housing is almost sort of a simulation, if you will. Now, this is like sort of the Baudrillard. This is the this is the Biffo type arguments that discusses how really the housing supply and things like a lack of housing and things like the Great Recession and the housing market crash were a result of the housing market no longer be determined by like material things like actual houses. It's determined by financial speculation and markets. It's data, it's semiotics, and how that gap between the semiotic market and the material housing creates a lot of different problems. And of course, there's the gender Ks. There's a lot of different gender Ks. A couple of the different main sorts of things that some of these Ks might be talking about is the public-private dichotomy, and how the home is usually treated as a sphere for feminine traits and a feminine domain, and that is a private space, which that treatment of the home as a private space often allows sometimes things like abuse and other things to go unspoken about and allowed to continue. But then there's also critiques of the nuclear family and the notion of the American dream, and how detached housing is part and parcel of that, and how there's gendered notions in this idea of which types of families are right for housing. Are queer folk? Are single people? what is appropriate and what's not. And then, of course, gender labor. Again, there's a gender component to labor. We think of labor in terms of like factory workers, but what about parents? What about caregivers who are taking care of disabled relatives? That is a form of labor, and that labor is often divided amongst gender roles and given to femme persons. Then, of course, queer theories, critique the notion that home can be a safe space. If you're a queer person and you're in a home where there's no acceptance, then home is not safe, and you have to engage in things like passing. And home is also a place where there's things like closets, and being closeted and passing and negotiating queer identity is part and parcel to this concept of the home. And of course, there's colonialism, settler colonialism and neo-colonialism. Again, a right to housing is basically building housing for settlers, but discussions of neo-colonialism are also important when you talk about places like, colonies of the United States, whether you're talking about, the Virgin Islands, or you're talking about other places, Puerto Rico. Do we have housing there? If not, why is there not enough adequate housing? And isn't that compounded as even worse, since we have some sort of colonial obligation to provide to them as a territory who aren't able to have their own economic interdependence to provide housing for themselves? Then, of course, there's anti-blackness. So whether you're talking about Afro-pessimism and talking about how investment in a right to housing is merely an investment in the same sorts of civil societies that are overdetermined through anti-blackness, then that's literally just rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. Or, fugitivity, and maybe like the concept of a home is one that's tying you down, when instead of trying to seek the security of the stable place within the state, we should be seeking flights of fugitivity to find our way out of these anti-black structures. Then there's Foucault, or biopower, biopower in general. And this has been theorized by both Foucault and Agamben, and both of their concepts apply very well to this resolution. Biopower, of course, is this notion that the government's ability to give life or protect life also necessitates then the ability for them to take away life. Because if the government is in charge of protecting you, anyone who is a threat to you can now be exterminated just to protect you. So it kind of looks at the dark underbelly of seemingly benevolent, nice government policies. Like, oh God, we're going to give you housing. Who wouldn't want the government to give housing? Well, now if we give you a right to housing, what happens if there's a gang of vandalizers? If there's a bunch of kids that are going around egging house and graffiti, we as the government promise to protect this right to housing and make sure it's adequate at all expense. Now we need to start sending police out to start taking down and preemptively taking down teenagers, anybody we think that might be a vandal. So there's a justified violence that comes on the tail end of protecting your right to housing. Then, of course, there's rights caves. Maybe guaranteeing a right isn't the best thing. And you can have that from a few different angles. You can have rights talk, where there's only a certain core amount of fundamental rights. And if you start to add other rights, that trivializes these fundamental rights. And soon now everything has the right. Everything's a right. And soon it's like the Beastie Boys, fight for your right to party. And we start to look at the fight for your right to party on the same level as a right to free speech, or the right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Or on the other end, there's the concept of rights malthus, where maybe rights are not good, where we're facing a serious ecological disaster and that we need to ration resources, and that rights get in the way of that. Because you know what? Rights prevent a totalitarian government from telling you what to do. But because of the horrible environmental predicament that we're in, we kind of need an authoritarian government to tell us what to do in order to divide resources. And rights get in the way. And then there's legal criticisms, all different types, from CLS to CRT to normativity. If you want to say that the law is unfair, if you want to say that the law is bad, if you want to say that the law contributes to elites or makes power distribution worse, you can do it on this topic. And then finally, the work of Deleuze is also going to be very valuable here. Deleuze theorizes a lot around the concept of the nomad and nomadism, and how we shouldn't be stationary and how we should always be looking for lines of flight. I mean, owning a house, there's nothing more stationary than that. I mean, owning a house and being tied to it is literally putting it in one place. It makes it very difficult to be nomadic if all of society is oriented around being planted in a house. Okay. Next, we're going to talk about the topic, critical affs, as well as the soft left k-affs. Again, this is not an exhaustive list of all the critical arguments that you can make on the neg. This is just to help you get started and get brainstorming for what you might be interested in. Now let's turn our attention over to the types of arguments that you can make on the aff from a critical perspective. So first we're going to start with the soft left critical affs. The top of the list has got to be your different anti-capitalist affs, because there's a lot of different affs that provide a right to housing that are going to challenge the core assumptions of capitalism, such as profit over people. So by providing a right to housing, you're not looking at it as a commodity. You're not looking at it as an item. You're looking at it as a social resource that should be secured. That goes against the logic of commodification and the logic of profit. So a right to housing could be used to challenge capitalist logics in the status quo. Now, there's also some really good affirmatives that can be made around ethics of care. So whether you're talking about some of the early gendered ethics of care from, theorists like Carol Gilligan, or some of the more modern queer care, disability, and the medical humanities. All of these are different great theories in order to base a soft left k-aff around. And the idea of these affs is pretty simple, in that the best way in order to engage with others and to choose what we should or should not do is through the lens of an ethic of care, which is that if we're always going around trying to care for other people, then everything in society is going to work out great. Because if I'm spending all my time, energy, and effort and love trying to care for you, and you're doing the same thing for me, then all of our needs are going to be met, and it's going to be sunshine, rainbows, Skittles, kittens. Everyone's going to love it. And then there's cosmopolitanism. We talked a little bit about this with Derrida, but there's a lot of different variations of cosmopolitanism. Personally, I love the version that one theorist, Salah bin Habib, talks about, which is more of a gender and gender-forward decolonial version of cosmopolitanism that says that we should have hospitality towards the other, specifically towards individuals like migrants. And so offering housing to migrants and other individual and vulnerable individuals is the ultimate act of hospitality and would be demonstrative of cosmopolitan ethic. And cosmopolitan ethics, which treat all of us as global citizens rather than citizens of single nations, is what's necessary to overcome things like nationalism or xenophobia, which contribute to systems of violence and war that plague our society today. Now, other great resources for soft left for affs, I'm just going to label this under housing for vulnerable folks, because there's a lot of different people throughout the United States who are very vulnerable due to their identity, their location, lots of different factors, so whether we're talking about the unhoused, whether we're talking about BIPOC individuals, LGBTQ+, we're talking about disabled folks, we're talking about people who have survived interpersonal violence, or intimate partner violence, both, sexual violence, trafficked persons, children, migrants, rural individuals, veterans. All of these individuals are vulnerable because of the things that they're going through, experienced, or who they are. And there's oftentimes some very good critical arguments as to why dedicating housing towards these specific groups of people are necessary to shining lights on the systems of oppression that caused them to be vulnerable in the first place. So whether we're talking about a great example of this would be veterans, housing for veterans. That is a great way to examine the structures of militarism because as we already talked about earlier, the GI Bill promised housing if you join the military, yet we have all these individuals who go across to fight wars in other nations like the Iraq War, which we claimed we needed to fight in order to find weapons of mass destruction, which were never there in the first place. So it was this imperialistic war to really go over there and secure war oil, but we pretended it was about weapons of mass destruction, and so we sent people over there for the reasons that we told them that they weren't worse, so we kind of lied to them and we sent them over there and they experienced horrific things, and now they're coming home and they're suffering from physical disabilities through mental disabilities, all because of the things that they experienced at the military. And all of this because they did that because they were promised the GI Bill, they were promised housing and they were promised education, and they get home and they get none of it. And so providing housing to veterans would be a great way of demonstrating how the military just chews people up and spits them out. And it's not really about this care for and love for the soldier. It's all about this care and love for the war and the military-industrial complex. And we're all just cogs in the machine. And so we need to shine light on that. But again, every single different one of these different vulnerable groups is going to have a different sort of critical lens that you can support to it. Then there's climate migration. Again, individuals are going to have to flee. We've talked about this in a bunch of different LD topics over the years. So we understand that individuals have to migrate due to climate change, and Affs that provide housing for them allow us to focus a spotlight on climate change and mitigation and adaptation strategies, and there's some critical benefits to that. And then finally, this is related to anti-capitalist apps up above, but there's some really good housing financialization apps that, again, if you think back to the critical slide that we just had, housing right now is intimately tied to systems of debt and is treated like a commodity. But if we treat housing as a right, that takes it away from the status of a commodity and takes it away from the status of just a debt instrument, and instead treats it more as a fundamental resource that we all deserve. Now, finally, let's talk about the hard left KFs. And these are the ones that go much further than just a simple topical implementation of the resolution. And so I'm going to focus on 3 different ones today. The first one is we're going to call land-based ethics. And this is where you're going to get a lot of your settler colonialism type affirmatives, which say that a right to housing that we should focus on is the right to housing for indigenous folks. Instead of ensuring and guaranteeing a right to housing for a bunch of settlers on stolen land, let's focus on a land-based ethic that gives housing to indigenous folk. And what that means, focusing on giving them the land back. And that is a prerequisite to understanding any kind of ethical conception of housing. Because if we don't understand that original disruption, the original housing insecurity that was caused as this land was settled, then all housing that takes place on, after, around, tangentially related is all still going to fall victim to those same sorts of settler tendencies. Then there's what we're going to call autonomous zones. Okay, why does a home have to be a house? Why can't a home be an area? Why can't a home be sort of an anarchist area or an autonomous zone? So there's a lot of different ways that you can defend that autonomous zones should be a house, and we have a right to autonomous zones. So whether we're talking about sort of like Zapatista areas that are controlled through, or we're talking about like more of like Occupy type movements where they occupy a physical space, or we talk about some of the places that opened up in Portland or Seattle during COVID where there were these autonomous zones and these encampments that were taken over in the middle of the city that kind of operated on their own sort of parallel plane outside of the rest of the world. All of these are different potential conceptions of a right to housing that could challenge our normal understanding and power structures of the world. And then the last area that we want to talk about, and so I'm just going to label futurities. And there's a lot of different types of futurities arguments. There's queer futurity literature, there's migrant futurity literature, there's Afro futurity literature, there's trans futurity literature, lots of different futurities. And this is the notion that the status quo is violent towards particular individuals, whether it be queer, migrant, black, etc., through structures like cis heteropatriarchy, through colonialism, neocolonialism, settler colonialism, anti-blackness, because the status quo places these individuals in, whether it's situations of overkill, gratuitous violence, whatever it may be, or described by the particular theory, that instead of consistently trying to reform the status quo, what we need to do is we need to imagine futures beyond this status quo reality so that we can see worlds that are livable and relationships that are possible and organizational sort of structures that are capable of giving any of these groups that we're talking about, or any of these people that we're talking about, life, being, living, and existence outside of the horrors of the status quo. And so quite literally, you imagine a different future. So whereas status quo homes might be violent for a lot of queer type folk because, again, they might be in homes where home is not safe, because it might not be safe to be gay in the family that you grew up in. Well, what if we imagined a different kind of home where everyone is radically accepted for whom they were? What if that future is what we presented? Or we have a super technological, awesome utopia that's in line with, the world, and we have all of these space age technologies where we no longer have to rely on extractivism, and we can all live, and we have universal basic income, and it's this super awesome future. Maybe if we envision that, then we can find the ways to work toward it to make it a reality. So depending on what your interest is, whether it's indigenous critical literature, whether it's black critical literature, whether it's migrant, queer, gender, etc., there are different types of futurities that can be discussed that reconceptualize what it means to truly have a right to housing on this topic. But again, this is not an exhaustive list. This is just a small little taste for y'all to get brainstorming, get thinking, and more importantly, get researching. Because the best critical ideas on this topic, whether it's AF or neg, are going to be found by you as you get in there and you really start to figure out what it is about this topic that you want to talk about. So, if you have any interest in learning more about anything that you heard from myself or Scott today, stick around, come back to myldcoach.com, subscribe to the YouTube channel, because over the next few months, there's going to be a lot of resources that are going to be coming your way to help you with every aspect of this topic. So whether you're a traditional debater, progressive debater, you're only competing on the local level, or you're trying to win it all in the circuit, there's going to be something somewhere along the way that can help you and around in the future. So thank you for sticking with us, and hope you have a great competitive season.